The longships cut through icy waters. Oars strike the sea like drumbeats of war. For centuries, they were unstoppable. The Vikings, raiders, traders, conquerors, legends of steel and fire. They terrorized Europe, plundered cities, shaped kingdoms. From the coasts of England to the rivers of Russia, their names were feared. But even empires built on blood cannot last forever. This is the story of how a mighty Viking empire, born in conquest, crumbled from within. A story of betrayal, overreach, and a world changing faster than the Vikings could adapt. The rise of power. The Viking Age began around 793 AD with the infamous raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne. It shocked Europe. A small group of warriors in longships burned, killed, and vanished as quickly as they appeared. But it was more than violence. Vikings were strategic. They built trade networks from Scandinavia to Baghdad. They established settlements in Ireland, Iceland, and even as far as Newfoundland, over 500 years before Columbus. By the 9th century, Viking leaders like Ragnar Lodbrok and later Ivar the Boneless carved empires. They were feared by kings, respected by merchants, and unstoppable on rivers, seas, and coastlines. But power comes with enemies. The internal tension. Viking society was not a single kingdom. It was a collection of clans, chiefdoms, and independent leaders. Loyalty depended on blood, gold, and fear. The same culture that made them fierce warriors also made them vulnerable. Clans often fought among themselves over territory, resources, and tribute. Chiefs vied for power, sometimes turning allies into enemies overnight. Ambitions clashed, and betrayals were common. Succession disputes further weakened unity, as rival heirs and claimants sparked feuds that could last generations. By the 10th century, these internal conflicts had already begun to fracture the Viking world, and the cracks would grow wider, leaving them exposed to both rivals and the expanding kingdoms around them. The challenge of kingdoms. While Vikings raided, the rest of Europe was changing rapidly. Kingdoms centralized their power. Armies became professional, trained to respond to threats rather than rely on ad hoc levies. Castles and fortifications began to rise from stone instead of wood, providing durable defense against raiders. In England, under Alfred the Great, fortified towns called burhs were established, armies were reorganized, and a navy capable of defending the coasts was built. In France, the Carolingian Empire was collapsing, but local lords quickly learned to resist Viking attacks through diplomacy, fortified positions, and regional militias. Vikings were no longer the unstoppable raiders of the 9th century. Europe was adapting, and the Vikings, used to swift and opportunistic raids, were slow to adapt in turn, leaving them increasingly challenged by evolving defenses. The economic shift. Vikings survived not just on raiding, but trade. Silver, furs, slaves, and luxury goods flowed through their ports. But by the 11th century, Europe's economy had matured. Coinage became more widespread. Cities became fortified trade hubs. Local merchants and armies could resist or outcompete Viking traders. The empire that thrived on sudden wealth found itself vulnerable to more organized economic systems. Religion, a double-edged sword. Christianity spread across Europe, reaching Scandinavia by the 10th century. Converting to Christianity wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Kings used it to centralize power. It created alliances against pagan Viking leaders. It eroded the traditional Viking honor system, which glorified raiding and vengeance. Some Viking leaders converted for survival, but these conversions divided clans, creating new tensions. Religion, which had once been a tool of power and unity, now became a wedge. The Great Raids turned dangerous. By the late 10th century, Viking raids faced unprecedented resistance. English coastal defenses stopped longships before they landed. Slavic and Russian principalities fortified riversides and demanded tribute. Normandy became both a haven and a political trap. The empire that thrived on terror found fear turned against them. Casualties rose. Raids became more dangerous, and the risk versus reward balance shifted. The inevitable collapse of power. Empires often fall not from enemies, but from internal decay. Viking leaders fought each other for dominance. Economic foundations weakened. European powers adapted faster than the Vikings could innovate. By the 11th century, the Viking Empire's expansion slowed dramatically. Many raiders settled instead of conquering. Normandy became a kingdom under Rollo. Irish settlements integrated with local clans. England absorbed Viking settlers into new societal structures. The empire that once spread terror became fragmented territories, trading raiders for farmers. The last great Viking conquests. Not all Vikings vanished quietly. King Canute the Great ruled over a North Sea empire, controlling England, Denmark, and Norway. It was the last great Viking empire, centralized, organized, but fundamentally different. It relied on diplomacy, taxation, and administration more than longships and axes. Yet even Canute's empire could not survive the next generation. Succession disputes, local rebellions, and changing political landscapes tore it apart. The Viking era, which had dominated for over 300 years, was ending. The role of technology and navigation. Vikings were master shipbuilders, but Europe eventually caught up. Heavier, more armored ships could survive rougher seas. Fortified castles dominated coasts. Crossbows and chainmail changed battlefield dynamics. Vikings, whose weapons relied on speed, surprise, and ferocity, were now competing with technology that neutralized those advantages. The age of the axe was giving way to the age of armor and artillery. Legacy in blood and culture. Even as the empire fell, the Viking influence survived. Place names: York, Jorvik, Dublin, Dublin, Normandy, Northmen. Genetics: Scandinavian DNA spread across Europe. Governance: some Viking legal systems influenced medieval law. Warfare: raiding tactics became part of European military strategy. They vanished as a political force, but left echoes everywhere they went. The final strikes. The 11th century brought the final blows to Viking dominance. English kings defeated Viking armies both at sea and on land, using better organization, fortified positions, and disciplined troops. In Norway, power became centralized under single monarchs, ending the era of independent raiding chiefdoms and uncoordinated expeditions. Sweden shifted its focus from raiding to trade and internal stability, prioritizing wealth through commerce rather than conquest. By 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge marked the definitive end of large-scale Viking invasions in England. Harold Hardrada fell in battle, and with him, the dream of Viking dominance died. Longships still sailed the seas, but the era of terror was over. Vikings transitioned from feared raiders to integrated participants in the European political and economic landscape. Their legacy endured in culture, settlements, and the memory of centuries-long influence, but their reign as unstoppable warriors had ended. Why Vikings fell. The fall wasn't caused by one event. It was the intersection of internal conflict and succession disputes, economic evolution in Europe, religious conversion creating political shifts, technological changes neutralizing raiding tactics, stronger European kingdoms centralizing power. Empires fall not because of battles alone, but because the world changes faster than they can adapt. Vikings were masters of the early medieval world, but they couldn't survive its evolution. The Viking legacy. The empire may have fallen, but the legend endures. Longships remain symbols of ingenuity. Norse mythology continues to inspire. Stories of warriors, raiders, and kings echo in literature and film. And in the ruins of castles, the echoes of axes, shields, and steel remind us. Even the fiercest empire cannot last forever. The Vikings ruled, they conquered, they inspired fear. But history always marches on. Their empire fell, but their legend will never die. If you stayed until the end, you didn't just learn about Vikings. You saw the rise and fall of an empire built on blood, courage, and ambition. Subscribe for more cinematic journeys into history's greatest empires. Like if this changed how you see the Vikings forever. Comment below. What empires rise and fall should we uncover next? Because history isn't just past, it's the story of power, ambition, and the price of survival.